We return again to our series Review from the Well based upon the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah, of course, lived in very difficult times, kind of like our own world, doesn't it? I was basically raised in what we call the golden age of the United States in the 50s and early 60s. I was a baby boomer product and grew up in a period of time where everything was just golden. I mean, job opportunities and finances and things like that. I mean, it was the Midas touch was everywhere in the nation. There was no such thing as if you wanted to work, there were jobs, and the jobs would were right there for you. Everything, the opportunities, whether it was colleges in those days, believe it or not, were almost brand new compared to today. If you wanted to go to college, you could. Colleges came to the high schools in normally February and March sometime and put on college days. You'd have 10 or 12 or more in even our podunk little high school. Colleges that have representatives with their tables trying to get people to sign up and to think about coming to this college or that school or whatever it happened to be, offering financial incentives and scholarships because there was just a huge amount of jobs that were opening up. The space age was just getting underway, expansion was everywhere, and as a result of that, the United States pretty effectively turned its back on God completely. There's nothing like prosperity on a human basis for people to get to be so selfish that they say, look what I did, look how much money I made, look how great a job of things I'm doing, what do we need God for in that environment? That was kind of similar to Jeremiah's day. Jeremiah, with a little bit of an extended view, was a kind of a holdover product, a baby boomer, so to speak, in some ways, maybe inversive. But Israel had had a fantastic run in back a couple hundred years, 200-300 years before, with prosperity, with God guiding them, with kings that sometimes struggled humanly, but for the most part, were well used by God, and the nation prospered, and things just flowed under the Mosaic economy in every direction. But then they decided they didn't need God anymore, and by the time you get to the century or century and a half before the time of Jeremiah, Israel was doing a great job of saying, look how great we are, look how much we can accomplish on our own. And by doing so, they forfeited the blessings of God. They took themselves out of the realm of God giving and God providing and God's grace being the operative product, and turned to their own strength and their own ways and their own wisdom. And by the time the Assyrians came by and captured most of that part of the country in the 8th century BC, followed by the Babylonians in the 7th century and so forth, you had some difficult times that were there. Paul predicted perilous times for the church. That's been almost 2,000 years ago, and he said you can expect it. And the older I get and the more I observe it, the more I see the spiritual warfare that even most believers don't see. And Satan in his long war against God, and trying to get Christians neutralized, compromising their faith, trying to get them distracted onto various issues. In and of themselves, the issues, you've got warfare, you've got disease, you've got pestilence and plague, you've got economics, you've got health, you've got this, you've got, all kinds of stuff, that's going on that does need to be addressed and we need to work through. But if we're not careful, the tail wags the dog. And in Jeremiah's day, that's exactly what was happening. A lot of stuff. Once again, chapter 2 of Jeremiah, as we begin this evening, what I feel is the key, the two, they blend, they kind of, obviously like hand and glove, integrate. But in chapter 2, somebody, if you read verse 13, if you forget everything in this study, except go to this verse, it will serve you well. Somebody read that nice and loud.
For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed them out a cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water.
Okay? There's two evils. This is God talking to the nation of Israel. He said, my people. Don't confuse that. He's not talking to the church here. The church hasn't been born yet. It's 1,000 years down the road. Okay? He's talking to the nation of Israel, his covenant people in the Old Testament time. And he said there are two principal problems, and he describes them as evil. Okay? That which is going to cause all kinds of problem with the nation. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living water. They walked away from the water of life. I mean, spiritually speaking, that's what he's saying. They've walked away from my provision of giving them life, prosperity, everything that goes with it. And then the second thing, they have replaced, since they've walked away from me, now there's a vacuum. There's a hole there. What does mankind do if he rejects God? He finds something to replace God. Might be his 401k, might be his hobbies, might be his mistresses. Who knows? I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that men choose to plug the hole, where only God was designed to fit in people's lives. And so what they've done is they have not only forsaken, they have hewed them out cisterns. They hewed out their own cisterns. Cisterns is just a big water bucket made out of rock. Okay, you hollow it out and fill it full of water. Think of a rain barrel, and you're on a large scale with a lid on it to keep it from evaporating. That's close. Okay, he said, but they're broken. They can't really hold the water that God provides. They've tried to replace me with something of their own invention. That's the problem that's there. And mankind's substitutes are ineffective when it comes to spiritual life. They simply won't get it. So what he boils down to, if you wanted to really condense it into kind of a proverbial statement, would be something like this: disobedience to God's revealed will is going to end in tragedy. Okay? Yeah. You say, how did you get that? Well, God said, you have forsaken me and you have tried to replace me. My will is that I be the centerpiece of your national life. In its Old Testament context, that's what he said. The God who brought them out of Israel. You remember that? The pillar of fire and the cloud of smoke that guided them day and night. Where God was their direction and their power and their provision, and the manna falling out of the sky and the quail and, water from the rock and all of that stuff. And they said, nah, we can do it ourselves. Okay. Yeah, okay. So, part one of our study was the nature of the beast, the thing that we struggle with within here. Part two had to do with core issues, dealing with the struggles, the main foundational struggles within that. And then we had the cries of the righteous. It's for the ones who are crying out to God for deliverance. And then last time we had the covenant-keeping God, the God that we can count on. That God has promised Israel's restoration for 1,000-year kingdom age. Okay? God promised that. He had made a covenant with Israel that they would, and that David would rule over them. A resurrected David would rule during that 1,000 years underneath Christ. God has promised Israel a new covenant for that age. That's God. That's God, the covenant-making and covenant-keeping God. He has promised this clearly throughout the Old Testament. These are not promises made to the church. We're the bride of Christ. We're in a whole different category. Okay, Old Testament Israel was the wife of Jehovah. Okay? If you study the language, it's very clear and it helps you get from getting mixed up. Okay? So, you have then Israel struggling because they wanted to do it their own way. You remember that verse in Judges that is prominent throughout the book? Every man did, there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. What's it repeated like 3 or 4 times throughout the book? I mean, virtually identical phrase. Okay? Well, when we reject God, we got to replace him with somebody else or something else, and that something else just isn't going to be God. That's all there is to it. Okay. So tonight we come to the fifth part, the last part of this particular study, having to do with the judgments of God. Looking at that, because after all, if God is going to keep his covenants, one of the things that he made a covenant about was bringing judgment. And remember what's going on in Jeremiah's time. During the time that a lot of this, well, again, Jeremiah is, remember, non-sequential, chronologically. There's jump back, jump forward, jump back, jump forward. It actually goes over something like almost 40 years that he actually wrote different segments of it. Most of it is condensed within just a period of less than 10 years, I'll put it that way. Some of it is a little longer than that. But there is no chronology. It's kind of just lumped in kind of very generally into great big categories. Okay? Chapter 1 is the call of Jeremiah to the ministry. Chapters 2 through 45, wow, what a chunk, is God's relationship with Israel, because Israel was, in fact, walking away from God. The majority of the nation had done just what chapter 2, verse 13 had talked about. And then you say, well, how about the last few chapters? Well, those are the Gentile nations. And when you get there, all it is judgment on the Gentile nations. And then there's kind of an appendix to the last chapter or 2 that kind of wraps things up historically with what's going on. Israel was in a hurt. Okay, it had had the godly kings, though they struggled at times. That's pretty obvious if you look at them and their history. But God prospered the nation over, by and large, until after Solomon's day, and then you had a divided kingdom, and you had the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes, and you had all kinds of politics and warfare and subterfuge, assassination plots. You'd almost think it was primetime television. Or it was Washington, D.C., one or the other, or maybe both, type of thing that's going on with some of the, left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. But the Assyrians, as previously mentioned, had come down, and by the time you get to 721-22, they had basically captured the 10 northern tribes, but had failed to capture the Judea, okay, the 2 southern tribes, the Judah area, which included Jerusalem. And because of God's miraculous deliverance of the city at that time, when the Babylonians came by, and about a century later, give or take, the arrogance of the nation had said, we're Supermen. I mean, there's no kryptonite anywhere that can take us down. God will deliver us whenever we fall into troublous times. Look what he did with the Assyrians. He whipped them overnight. We've got tin pants on. You can't mess with us. It's the arrogance of the national pride on a nation that was turning its back on the very God that they were claiming to be their God. It didn't work very good. Okay, as part of that, of course, then you had the whole historical accounts that Nabopolassar came in. He was Nebuchadnezzar's father. Started the whole conquest thing. Nebi took over, and completed the project, including this siege of Jerusalem, where, guess who? Jeremiah is right in the middle of that whole thing. And there's all kinds of difficult times that are there. In order to kind of set the background, though, for the judgments of God, keep your finger there in Jeremiah, but go to the book of Daniel. And I'm not going to spend a great deal of time. You've got the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then you got the minor prophets. If you have forgotten, the only reason they call them major prophets is their length. Okay? The major prophets have 60 chapters, 50 chapters, 48 chapters. The minor prophets have 12, 8, 3, 1, that type of stuff. That's so they're lumped together that way. Book of Daniel takes place during the latter end of the Babylonian rule. So he's after the time of Jeremiah. And God had said through the prophet Jeremiah that there would be 70 years of captivity under the Babylonian rule, and then they would be free. Well, Jeremiah's time hit just about, he had been hauled off, of course, Daniel had, clear off over to, Persia, today, the Persian Gulf, all that stuff over there. He had been held captive over there as one of the exported captivity young men under the whole plan of remold the next leadership generation of the Jewish nation, indoctrinate them into Babylonian philosophy and then send them back to rule for the Babylonian Empire, because nothing like a Jew with his head full of foreign philosophies to gain the trust of the people and then make them into little Babylon. Okay? That's essentially what happens with our college situation. Okay? Now that's not bad-mouthing anybody, individually. I'm just saying that when John Dewey took over the public education system, okay, wow, it's been 90 years ago now, and was appointed the director of the public education system in the United States, Dewey was a communist. Dewey was an avowed socialist. Okay? His idea was to take the children out of the home as soon as possible and indoctrinate them for the good of the nation. And of course, the good of the nation is always dependent upon who defines what good is. And, Mr. Dewey, with his socialism, had a completely different idea of how that should work its way out. Okay, similarly, I don't know whether he got the idea from Babylon or not, because a lot of countries used to do it. You would indoctrinate them within that. Daniel was one of those that the indoctrination didn't take very well, frankly. He maintained his Jewish integrity and his loyalty to the Most High God all throughout the book. And in Daniel chapter 9, God gives a promise prophetically, concerning the end of this captivity period and how all of that would work out. And again, for the sake of time, we can't go through a whole bunch of it, but you will get the idea. It's called the 70 weeks prophecy. Week there meaning, if you look at it, and you have to tie in a bunch of other scripture, but it clearly indicates in verse 24 that there's going to be 70 weeks determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city. He's talking about there's going to be 70 weeks of years. Okay, a week is 7 weeks of years. You multiply the whole mess out, 70 weeks, 70 times 70, 490 years. Okay, cross-index, book of Revelation, the other prophets, it's not an issue to nail that down. It's just the way they kept track of things. They're euphemisms in that day and age. And he says this is going to directly focus upon the nation of Israel and Jerusalem as its capital city. It has nothing to do with the United States. It has nothing to do with New York City, Washington, D.C., Denver, Colorado, San Francisco, California. It has nothing to do with any of that per se. There might be the ripple effect when it goes into place, but the nuclear strike is not going to be San Francisco. It may need it, but it's not going to be San Francisco. The nuclear strike is going to hit Jerusalem. The ripple effect, the shock waves are probably going to affect San Francisco, but you get the idea, okay? And he says there is a whole bunch of prophecies. There's like 6 or 7 different statements in here to validate all of this. And he says, he indicates that this is going to be for a particular reason, and after a certain period of time, the Messiah is going to make an appearance, okay? Israel is going to reject the Messiah. He's going to die. That's what it talks about. The Messiah will be cut off in verse 26. And then there's going to be an individual that comes from the prince of the people that shall come. And there's going to be a 7-year peace treaty that this individual signs guaranteeing with Israel, guaranteeing Israel's safety. You know? Wow. Can you imagine that today? Boy, there's some interesting political and military alignments that are maneuvering around. But the point here is not to give you all the details of this end times prophecy, okay? Because this 70th week, this last 7 years that is talked about, the 70th week, after the Messiah has been killed, there's a gap of time, and then the covenant is signed. That has never been signed. We don't have that yet. Never in the history of the world. One of these days it's going to happen. Somebody is going to convince Israel that he can protect the country. Neat trick, surrounded by 350 million Arabs right now, but you get the idea. There's going to have to be some very serious political alignments that go on. And at that time, what they call the time of Jacob's trouble, we call it the Great Tribulation. Okay? We call it the book of Revelation, chapter 6 through 19, because that's exactly what it speaks of. More on that in a few moments. The point here that I want to get your attention on is the fact that Daniel says there's going to be in the future. Daniel is guaranteed there's going to be an end time event upon this people in this country, in this city, that's going to be the centerpiece for all of these end time things to come to fruition and culminate in the return of the Messiah. Now, we call it the second coming, not the rapture, don't get confused there, but the second coming of Christ. So you've got all of that is part of what the judgments are, because what you find in Revelation is a whole series of judging during that 70th week. A major worldwide, excluding no one on the face of the earth, time of judgment, to the point where when we went through this in a seminary class, it was kind of got down to the point where between 96 and 97% of the world's population would be killed during the last 3.5 years of that time. Okay? That's a lot of bodies. It really is. So, this is not just some little war in the Ukraine where some thousands are dying, or in Guatemala, or, some type of oppression, in the middle of Africa or something.
Chicago.
Or Chicago, yeah, as the case may be. So you have all that. But let's look at some things specifically in Jeremiah. So you turn back there. And I just snagged out what I feel are some that are illustrative of the whole thing. Begin in chapter 19 of this. And you remember once again that the chronology of Jeremiah is back, forth, back, forth. Okay? It's not chronological like the gospel accounts of the life of Christ. It's not that way at all. In chapter 19, you have God instructing Jeremiah to go and purchase a potter's earthen bottle. Okay? Something that ancestrally has been around. It has been used by your people, by the priesthood. It's one of those great grandma brought it over on the wagon train type of family heirloom type of thing. And then he says, take it off out to the valley of Hinnom and shatter it. And I'm not going to go through the whole chapter for you. And then he renames this valley. And if you look at verse 6, he says now going to be known as the Valley of Slaughter. Okay? It's going to be where Israel at some point in the future is going to be judged, and thousands upon thousands upon thousands will die. Now this thing is on the tag end of Jerusalem, if geographically speaking. Verse 9, somebody read verse 9. Somebody who has a strong stomach. Go ahead and read that.
And I will cause them to eat the flesh of their sons and the flesh of their daughters, and they shall eat every one of the flesh of his friend in the siege and straitness, wherewith their enemies, and they that seek their lives shall straiten them.
Yeah. Now this, in its first, let's say, its partial fulfillment, came to pass during the siege of Jerusalem. Okay. Again, a lot of prophecies in the Old Testament have both the near and the far fulfillment, or partial and completed fulfillment. Different term, same thing. Okay? The near one was to prove that you could count on the far one in its completion. The near one was then the next week or the next month or within our lifetime to prove that the one that is still coming 2,000 years down the road was equally true. And so it would verify the fulfillment one of the one down the road. This actually came to pass during the siege of Jerusalem. Okay? They, in almost 2 years, and they ran out of food. That was one of the principal areas, and people were eating their own kids and each other's kids, and and you don't know, give them the benefit of the doubt, maybe they had died of something else or whatever. I mean, we won't even go into the grisly possibility. Pretty nasty stuff. And then he says, that's that whole broken bottle thing. That shows that. Now, if you go to the very last verse, it says, the Lord of hosts said to Israel, I will bring upon this city and upon all the towns all the evil, means calamity, that I have pronounced against it, because they have hardened their necks and will not hear my words. Okay? God was in such a covenant relationship with Israel, that the judgment upon Israel for breaking the covenant was equally serious. Somebody casually, for instance, comes by and promises that, says, well, I'll drop by sometime and help you out with with hauling that hay in. Well, you've never seen the guy before, and he weighs 43 pounds, and the hay bale's 3 times as big as he is. Well, you're not real confident you're going to get much help out of it. Okay? But God comes by and says, I'll do the whole job, but you have to have faith. And Israel said, nah, we'll go with the 43-pounder. Okay? And so you lose all the blessing. Okay? Kind of like that, the whole broken bottle thing, that everything goes with it. Chapter 20, that is non-sequential, records the fact that Jeremiah was so popular that Pashmur, who was one of the big city officials, wound up throwing him in stocks. He wound up in stocks, in jail, in the well, in the bottom of the cistern, under house arrest. I mean, it was, the guy had a troubled life in that way. Okay? So that's what you have as far as God indicating judgment upon a disobedient nation. I would suggest to you that that principle has been true regardless of what nation you are or have been for thousands of years. If you are a nation that turns your back on God and says, we'll do it our way and we'll replace God with our own program and format, don't expect God's blessing. On top of that, expect that God will withdraw his protective umbrella that the nation may have begun with. Our own nation, I think, is a good illustration of that. It started off on godly principles. Recognizing. Go back and read the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and some of the writings in the Federalist Papers and stuff. And it's very clear. Now, were they all devout Christian men, born-again believers? I have no idea. Okay? On the other hand, I'm not so sure most of you are. Sometimes I question myself. You know, because myself doesn't act very Christian at times. Okay? So I'll leave that aspect of it. God will take care of that part, won't he? Okay? But you have then this whole situation that nation after nation, including ours, you know, founded sometimes on very godly principles and writings and, you know, morality and ethics and law system and everything else, you know, but after a while we replace God with a broken cistern. And then we wonder how come we're in such trouble because all the water leaks out. Yeah, I mean, see, this stuff isn't new, is it? It really isn't. Go to chapter 21. And you can find, there's judgments beyond, there's literally scores of them mentioned in here. In chapter 21, somebody read verse 8 for us. We'll see if we can put it in context.
And unto this people thou shalt say, Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I set before you the way of life and the way of death.
Okay. Again, context. It's critical to know who he's talking to. He's talking to Israel, specifically to the inhabitants of the nation of Jerusalem that are being besieged by the Babylonian army. This has taken place 2,700 years ago, give or take a little bit. Okay? And he says, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to give you an option. You can pick door number 1. Okay? Door number 1, the way of life. Door number 2, the way of death. There is no door number 3. Okay? You've got one or the other. Now, it's unique because if you read through the chapter, this is a judgment upon Jerusalem and its inhabitants then. Principles carry forward, but that's what in its context we're talking about. Okay? And he says, you stay here, you're either going to be killed or you're going to go into captivity. Then smart money is door number 1, the way of life, which is not sharpen your sword, get on the walls, and repel the borders. Door number 1 is run. Get out of town. Flee. Okay? Because that's the only way you're going to preserve your life. You know, God doesn't always do things the way we think. You know, we're kind of raised on John Wayne and the American ego that says we're bigger and tougher than anybody and we can whip anybody, you know, blah, 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 you know, and if I can't, my daddy's bigger than your daddy, you know, that type of stuff, you know, on the, you know, schoolyard bully type deal. No, he says, no, he said just the opposite that what you and I would humanly think. You know, we've got to stand strong right here and put our shoulders together and, you know, keep our powder dry. And God says, no, you need to run. Because the context makes a difference. Okay? This is not the other heroes of the Old Testament who did this or called upon to do that. This is not Gideon and his lamp. You know, this is not, you know, Moses going out across the Red Sea. You know, this is not all of that. No, this is context sensitive. And one of the reasons I include this is that people get so confused when they read something in the Old Testament and then try to plug the church right into the middle of it. Okay? No, this is a judgment that is, once again, context sensitive. You've got to know to whom was God speaking, what was the situation, when did it occur, and what exactly was involved in that judgment. In chapter 24, you have, again, skipping through, but just picking out, you have God showing Jeremiah 2 baskets of figs. And it turns out that one basket was, man, this was fantastic. It was the best looking set of, mwah, you know, just make you drool over it. The other one was full of mold and worms, you know, and was obviously, should have been sold a month ago at the market, and, you know, and just forget it. And he calls them evil figs, there in verse 8. But the good figs, okay, interestingly enough, he says in verse 5, the good figs will be carried away captive. Okay, they're going to be captives of Judah. He says, I have sent out of this place into the land of Chaldea for their good. He said, the people that are taken captive and get out of this city before it's demolished, he said, that's the good basket. Again, opposite from what you and I would think. But again, remember the judgment of God. God said, I'm going to destroy the place. I'm going to tear it down. You've turned your back on me. You've tried to replace me with idolatrous stuff. You know, and he said, I'm going to wipe it out. I said, I'm going to level it as a sign of my judgment. By the way, for what it's worth, in case I disremember, according to the historians, okay, when Nebuchadnezzar, kind of similar to in AD 70 when Titus destroyed the city, but when Nebuchadnezzar, broke down the walls and came in, his army came in after a nearly 2-year siege, he butchered hundreds of thousands of Jews. His army just killed them and killed them and killed them and killed them. And the ones that yielded, most of them were taken captive or left there as slaves of the Babylonian overlords. Okay? The ones who had already fled or had already gone to Babylon, if you want to put it that way, okay, were the good basket of fruit. God's judgment, he says, judgment is thorough. It's going to happen however you want to deal with it. Chapter 23, if you go back just a few verses, has got some specifics as well. In chapter 23, beginning toward verse 25, and, he says, I have heard what the prophets say. They prophesy lies in my name. They say, I've dreamed. In other words, God has spoken to me. Listen, well, folks, you've got this on a secular basis, in its own fashion. You've also got it inside of modern day Christendom. Okay? You've got people that claim to have messages from God. Okay? We do have messages from God. It's called the 66 books of the Bible. Okay? But that's not what these modern day prophets tell you. The modern day prophets tell you that there are aliens hidden on a spaceship traveling behind Halley's Comet as it comes through, and if we all just drink cyanide-based Kool-Aid, or whatever it happens to be, and we all put plastic bags over our head, and we've all got $5.67 in our pockets, and we're all dressed. You realize what this is. This is an actual occurrence. Back when that comet came through, you had a suicide cult that died, Los Angeles someplace. I mean, all good things come out of Los Angeles.
As quick as they can.
Yeah, as quick as they can, yeah. And don't leave anything important, that way you don't have to go back. But it's this type of, okay, you guys know Nichelle Nichols. Anybody know who Nichelle Nichols is? She's Lieutenant Uhuru on the old Star Trek series. You all know that, right? Well, too bad. Her brother was one of the ones that committed suicide. Okay? And they had on identical Nike tennis shoes and identical gym outfits, and they all drank poison, and they all had, I think it was $5.87 or $5.67 in their pocket. And they all then, after they drank the poison, put the plastic bags over their head and tied them off with zip ties, so because they were going to join the aliens. Now, this is tragic stuff. It really is. These are human beings. Wow. God, however, doesn't condone this kind of nonsense. He says we have a one true God, and our responsibility is to Him and Him alone. If you then jump over to chapter 28, you have kind of a test. And by the way, here you jump forward you jump backward 7 years, but you've been backward about 20 years before then, trying to work. The only way you can work the chronology, okay, is to go through, especially at the beginning of the chapters, and find out who exactly is being talked about. Say, chapter 28, for instance, says, it came to pass the same year in the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah, in the 4th year, in the 5th month, and so forth. Okay? And then you go back to chapter 27, in the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim, who actually is called Zedekiah in most part, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. So you're going forward and going back. You're jumping forward and back in the different, again, the chronology. It's kind of fun to try to figure it out, but when you get done, I don't know if you've gained a whole lot, in all honesty. Chapter 28, verse 9 says, "The prophet who prophesies of peace, when the word of the prophet shall come to pass, then that prophet will be known that the Lord has truly sent him." Okay. Now, here's this whole thing about judgments. God has promised judgments, and he's promised it upon the nation of Israel. He's promised it on Jerusalem. If you were an inhabitant of Jerusalem in 588 or 89 or 90 BC, you would probably think that this Nebuchadnezzar army siege that's going to lay waste to the city is all that you could ever think about God judging the ungodliness of Israel. No. Jeremiah says, when you see that come to pass, okay, and it will be devastating, realize that it's only the near fulfillment. But you can trust the far fulfillment because the near fulfillment did come to pass. Okay. God literally judged the nation and the city because of its sin. Okay. The completed judgment is yet to take place. As nasty as that was, with people eating their own kids, and tens of thousands of people dying, hundreds of thousands dying, and captivity and everything else. God, in effect, through the prophet Jeremiah says, you ain't seen nothing yet. Hang around until you get to the 70th week of Daniel. Obviously, humanly, we can't do that. We don't live that long. But he says, my judgment then is just as certain as my judgment's going to be next month when the walls come down and Nebuchadnezzar's army overflows the city. That's what he's saying. You can count on it all the way through. In chapter 30, and again, there's all kinds of stuff in between, verse 7 talks about the time of Jacob's trouble. I've already referred to it. It's called the Great Tribulation period. Technically, it's the last 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week. We know that from the book of Revelation as well as Ezekiel and so forth. Okay. Then in verse 23 of chapter 30, he says, behold, the whirlwind of the Lord goes forth with fury, a continuing whirlwind. It will fall with pain on the head of the wicked. Think Revelation 6 through 19 in its consummation. That's what's still coming. That's what, ultimately Jeremiah is looking down the road at, everything that goes with it. Chapter 33. Somebody read verse 3 for us. You recognize the verse, many of you.
Verse 3.
Verse 3.
Call unto me, and I will answer thee, and shew thee great and mighty things, which thou knowest not. I think I have a misprint.
Isn't that a great verse? It's a great verse. In its context, it's got, ready for it? Nothing to do with you and I. Okay? Who is God talking to? The word of the Lord comes to Jeremiah while he's, at this point, he's out of the stocks and out of jail. He's now shut up in prison. He says, you, Jeremiah, you, call unto me. Again, context sensitive. Does the principle apply to all believers that they can call upon the Lord and the Lord will reveal himself? Yes. Okay? It does. And it's okay to have this hanging on the wall, on one of your placards, a little embossed, this and that. Great. But do remember the context. Don't try to plug the church into here. It doesn't work. Yeah. God says to Jeremiah, he says, you cry out to me, I will answer you, and I'm going to show you some fantastic stuff. but you're not necessarily gonna like it all, okay? And this is also where we part company, okay, with our interpretation. We often think that I will show thee great and mighty things, he says, that you're not even aware of yet. You know what he showed him? He showed him the destruction of Jerusalem, the deaths of tens of thousands, the devastation to the entire nation. Eh? He said, I'm going to show you. We automatically take great and mighty things and we think, heaven. You know, it's if you're musical, harps on clouds. If you're not, shotguns on pheasants. You know, something like that. You know, but you know, don't try to read stuff into it. Okay? Yes, the principles are there, but don't. I run into it all the time. I'll be honest, including, by the way, with a lot of pastors. Some of them need some help here. Verse, what? Let me see, I'm almost done here. Chapter 39, as we kind of wrap up here, and I'm just skipping some stuff, obviously. By the time you get to chapter 39, you're dealing with July 18th, 586 BC. Because we know from historical sources when the wall went down and when the Babylonian army, you know, devastated Jerusalem. That's when it started. And it took several days, of course, to fight its way through Jerusalem and you know, kill and plunder and everything that went with it. That's what chapter 39 is all about. Again, once again, God's judgment upon a nation that has said, we don't need God anymore. We can do it our way. You know, we'll hew out our own cisterns, you know, and we'll put our own gods in there. Maybe it's the god of the military prowess. Maybe it's the god of Wall Street. You know, I mean, I don't know. You know, people trust in all kinds of stuff. Even David at one point, remember, got into trouble because he trusted in chariots. And went and numbered the chariots when God said, I'll give you the victory. You don't need to do anything about it. And David said, well, I better go and check and make sure I got enough, you know, loaded guns here, you know, to do this. You know, and God withdrew his blessing because of it. Now, this fulfillment, if you want to know all the appendix stuff, then right here, especially after chapter 39 and 40, because in verse 41, you go to all of the judgment upon the Gentile nations that were involved at that time. Okay? Which indicates that God, in the future, in the 70th week of Daniel, in the end time fulfillment, is also going to judge all the nations, which Scripture is very clear he does. But when you go from chapter 39 and 40, what you go to historically is the book of Lamentations. Okay? And it's called that for a very real reason, isn't it? It is a grisly book. It goes through and repeats the baby eating thing, cause all the horrors and everything that goes with it, and Jeremiah crying his heart out over Jerusalem in its fallen state. Okay? Yeah, God did not withhold his judgment. Remember, this, in the Old Testament, this is God's chosen nation. This is the nation that he wanted to utilize to put on display to show his grace and his goodness to all those unsaved nations around them. Okay? Go back and you read Exodus 19 and 20, especially chapter 19, and I want to make you a showpiece. I want to put you in all of these pagan peoples. I want to show all of these other peoples, you know, what it is to be a nation of God's people. And what a contrast that should be in your righteousness and your holy life's conduct and everything that goes with it. And they said, all that the Lord hath commanded, we will do. And of course went out and carved out a golden calf, you know, within just a matter of a few days. God judges. Book of Lamentation, God's judgment, once again. If you want further on this, if you jump over to the end time type of thing, obviously you wind up with the book of Revelation. And I say chapter 6 through 19 because that's where the real detail is of that 70th week of Daniel. But you also have Matthew 24 and Matthew 25 and the other parallel accounts, where the abomination that makes desolation signs that peace treaty and becomes the world dictator, and the great tribulation then kicks into play, and people are fleeing. Interestingly enough, Jesus' counsel is get out of town when you see this beginning to happen. Now, some people will say he was talking about Nebuchadnezzar 6 centuries before. No, he wasn't. He was talking about the abomination that makes desolate, and during the future time when the fulfillment. He said that was just partial. In effect, he says you ain't seen nothing yet. He said, if you happen to be alive and living in that part of the world at that time, and you see these events take place, this is going to be following the rapture of the church. This is not church stuff. He said, you had better run, because Jerusalem's going to get leveled. It really is. So you've got all that and more. Ends up, of course, if you want to talk about judgment, you've got the judgment of sheep and goats at the second coming, and then you got the great white throne judgment at the end of that 1,000 year. It's just go, go, go. It really is. Okay? Peter talks about this when he writes 2 Peter in chapter 3. He talks about, goes clear back and starts with, in the days of Noah, men thought that was all foolishness and everything and denied all of that stuff and got wiped out. And ready for it? The judgment of God. God brought the great flood. And he says they're willingly ignorant that this came to pass. In the future, men are going, willingly ignorant means people choose to be stupid. Okay? Why? Because they've replaced the God of Scripture with their own broken cistern, and they choose to say, I don't believe in that God of the Bible stuff. I'm doing great on my own, thank you very much. Pretty ugly stuff when you think about it. I guess the question comes, and God says, through Peter, he says, I'm going to level it with. And some people ask, well, it hasn't happened yet, so it never gonna. They forget the fact that God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. God is long-suffering to usward. You think sometimes you're really doing a great job when you put up with somebody who you just like to punch in the nose. And your spirit-controlled temperament, right? Well, think how controlled God has to be. He's been putting up with us for thousands of years. Okay, and he just hasn't wiped it. That was Moses' question. Remember when he came down off the mount? And God said, maybe I should just wipe out the nation and start over, Moses. It was a test for Moses. And Moses said, it's not going to look good on your resume. You brought them out of Egypt and have provided for them just in order to wipe them out and start over. What are other people going to think about you? Down at the coffee shop, drinking a little espresso, talking about current events, and say, "Did you hear God wiped out Israel because they really irritated him?" Well, who wants to respond to a God that just might get irritated and poof, smoke you? You see how that works. So God tested Moses, and Moses gave the correct response. Could God have done it? Well, sure. But it didn't serve the right purpose. Where do we see ourselves in it? Really. And what are we going to do about it? Kathy?
When you emphasize that we're reading about Israel, and and Israel is not the church, that's absolute. But we have the same God, and we're doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So it is cautious.
What should we expect?
What should we expect?
God smoked his own people, his own chosen nation.
He doesn't change.
He
doesn't change.
And it's the same God Well, if we're gonna replace the biblical God with Wall Street God or Washington DC God or whatever, you know, the intellect or vain imaginations of men, don't expect God to be happy about it, so to speak. Don't expect God to bless, you know, when we've walked away from Him and His truth. It won't work that way, okay? You know, again, that God knows. But what is not our job collectively, but you might also ask, what is my job individually? Okay? You know, people say, well, what happens if you find yourself on a sinking ship? Throw life preservers to the people that are drowning. There's always something you can do. You know, yeah. Normally what we do, the first thing we do is we think of our own selves, don't we? Where's my life preserver? You know, the difference is I know where I'm going. You know, somebody else that is out there floundering in the water may not. Maybe he needs another chance to make up his mind. Don't know. Anyway, we've got fresh raspberries and ice cream waiting at the house. So let's have a prayer. Father, thank you for this evening. We thank you for what we've been able to glean in small ways, and I hope not too disjointed, from the book of Jeremiah. Things that Jeremiah went through that are so parallel in so many ways to our own country, but not just our country. There have been other countries in the history of man that have equally started out well and then turned their backs on the righteousness that only you provide, and have suffered because of it, have fallen into decline, decay, even been completely now off the scene. So Lord, let us recognize that you are indeed the God of judgment, but you're the God of grace as well. And let us rely upon you to do what will honor you. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. Amen.